Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Last Man on Earth, Season 3, Episodes 13 through ultimately 18. So, we are here today to ultimately just kind of like go into here and say one thing that I forgot to mention uh, on the last review. Ultimately, there was a moment in those other episodes where we consistently had it to where Tandy was ultimately dressing up in a dinosaur, and I ultimately I had completely forgotten about mentioning any portion of that. Um, Having Todd basically scareless and really have it to where Todd is just smacking Tandy every single time that Tandy is to basically show up with this dinosaur like getup and scare people. Um, I really thought that that moment was probably the most hilarious thing going on in those episodes, and I completely had spaced out about it. But ultimately, we end up having some interesting things going on within these episodes, and so ultimately we end up having a new person again appear upon the show uh, that they kind of have to dedicate a lot of time to seemingly this character, as well as some people coming back to otherwise have a brief extent on this show, as well as seemingly us trying to figure out where to go along into next within this show, because it seems like they end up having to like bottle every season within itself, where we end up having it to where ultimately we have an entire season of uh, ultimately having Tandy seemingly getting all of his friends together and ultimately living in Tucson. Then in the second season, we seemingly have um, a bulk of an entire season in Malibu for the most point. And in this season, we're kind of having a otherwise shift to going into this building for a bulk of this entire season and to see what is to happen here. I think this season overall, I would say there's a lot of times of which that there is really desperation for every single one of these characters, and there's also like a very heavy amount of concern if everything's going to work out for every single one of these characters, and eventually when they do, you're kind of like huzzah, yay, something's happening for all these characters that I ultimately like. So going into here, we end up having it to ultimately somewhere in these episodes we end up having them eventually having to be forced to eventually evacuate where they are at to move on to a brand new location towards the tail end of this season. And so, really, it's kind of interesting enough that we end up having a character like Carol that is very much a person that doesn't want to leave anywhere, ultimately being ripped away from what she knows altogether. So going into this show, I immediately thought that still this show is um, it's still a really really funny show. I also kind of feel like in these episodes, they honestly kind of like these episodes kind of drag, to be brutally honest. Like introducing a character so that way you can kind of really just milk that character for all it's worth, and then ultimately kind of milk like certain situations, to be brutally honest, within the episodes. Um, like really kind of stretching the story until ultimately they have like a real grandmaster plan of what to do towards the tail end of this. Like I didn't feel that before with any of the other shows, but I feel that now within certain characters and certain situations and stuff along those lines. That's ultimately how I kind of just feel. So going on into here, I still like the show. It's just, it's just, man, I really want there to be a real legitimate reason for story. Like, it kind of feels like a lot of it is just like, hey, here's a random bag of writing that we can go into today. And that's what I kind of felt like these episodes were. We're just kind of like a random bag of just like, hey, let's find this person and then just explore this person kind of thing. And really just stretched this season to just get it over with. Um, but ultimately, maybe the next season, they're going to be doing some interesting things, I hope, or otherwise, it's just going to be another just, hey, let's just stretch this season. Because it's going to be, unfortunately, it's going to be, I would to be guessing the last season. Unless ultimately there is another season coming and I'm not realizing it because I didn't know if it was canceled or not because I didn't look that up. So going in here, let's ultimately go into just talking about these episodes. Again, Dinosaur Tandy is probably the best thing out of this show so far. It's a thing that once it walks into frame, I'm just laughing. But other than that, there isn't much of there isn't much going on here. Because reasonably we have it to where like Tandy ultimately goes and does the usual thing, finds a swimming pool, fill it with something, and that's kind of what the show is right now. It's um, Forte and all the other people. They're just kind of like, okay, well, let's just fill the show with something. Um, and to kind of get us out of this, to transition us to somewhere. So let's go into that double fived time territory. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil these episodes. So we ultimately seemingly have a photo that is taken that they are to otherwise realize that seemingly there is some Yoda-esque looking kid that is to be discovered. Really, that is a bulk of what is kind of happening in these episodes. Because we end up having it to where the focal point is mostly on this kid that they end up calling Jasper. Because they never actually learn the kid's name, nor when the kid actually does talk within these episodes, he does not mention what his actual name is or anything about him. If anything, a lot of the stuff that he ends up saying is one liners like thank you or you're welcome or something along those lines. So the kid eventually does talk, it's just not right away. So we end up having it to where ultimately we end up having it to where Phil, Carol, and Erica all go out to try and greet this kid with their seemingly grass camouflage gear on. And so we end up having it to where they are to try and find this kid. They end up finding the home that he's in, but they don't exactly find him. And we end up having it to where both Carol and Phil end up driving off, while Phil ends up jumping out of the car to ultimately go and stay at this kid's home for the seemingly entire night to ultimately persuade this kid by yelling at him to ultimately come back with them, to live with them, to whatever. And we ultimately have it to where Phil eventually gives up. He ends up giving up and going back into the car with Carol and Erica. And we end up finding out that this Yoda character ultimately pops his head out of the trunk because I guess he was in the trunk the entire time. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, we are to commingle this kid into the story heavily, and I mean heavily. Um, we end up having it to where ultimately we are to have this kid kind of be involved with the group. We end up eventually having it to where they give him food. The kid takes the Yoda mask off, and they are to reveal that ultimately, like, hey, like, this kid has a backpack that says Jan Sports on it. How about we call him Jan Sports? And ultimately, they're like, no, we should call him a real legitimate name because this kid won't say anything. And so they end up calling him Jasper because it's similar to Jan Sports, I guess. So they end up calling him Jasper, and ultimately, it seems that they aren't getting any edgewise with this kid. It seems that Tandy is eventually giving Jasper a volleyball that ultimately has a face on it to ultimately say, hey, this guy has gotten me through some hard times. Jasper takes the volleyball and tosses it off to the side for it to get sadly run over. We end up having it to where reasonably uh, Phil is trying any number of things to ultimately get this kid to be like his best friend, because that's what Phil has to do with every single person, is to make every single new person that comes in his best friend, like he's just that needy or whatever. So we end up having it to where Phil otherwise tries extravagantly as possible to make this kid happy, ultimately by giving him uh, a swimming pool of Sunday, let's just say, by having a entire uh, uh, small swimming pool filled with hot fudge, nuts, whipped cream, and all kinds of things for this kid to have. And the kid never gets into the pool one ditch second. We end up having it to where Phil eventually goes into the pool because that's just what he does, and he ultimately drinks his other pool of margarita that is standing and sitting next to it, or sitting next to the other pool with the seemingly sundae, questionably. So, because there's no ice cream. So we go along into here, and ultimately we end up having it to where reasonably Phil ends up just demanding that Jasper end up choosing somebody that he will like to be his guardian or his seemingly his person, his whatever. And so we end up having to where Jasper ends up choosing Erica. And so we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Jasper is to eventually seemingly have a fun time with Erica, and he's ending up sleeping in a tent, and we end up having it to where Phil is going to try to comfort him, uh, or kind of say goodnight to kind of Jasper, and he ends up finding the volleyball in this guy's hands, and so it's like, oh, okay, I see how it is. It's like Phil can't do anything to otherwise appease this kid, but Erica can. Um, we end up having to also pushing on here. We end up seemingly having it to where ultimately uh, they end up throwing a birthday for Jasper, and so we end up having it to where also Todd is having to uh, Todd is having to go out and um, is ending up to have to forcibly go out and get medication for Melissa because it seems that she is on some medication that ultimately he can't figure out what it is. And so ultimately we end up having it to where uh, 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 Todd is to end up asking Melissa, well, like, what is this medication? And ultimately, she keeps saying Santa Claus's pee-pee or whatever. I'm saying it the cleaner variation. So we end up having it to where ultimately to where Todd is going to have to, like, it seems that both Todd and Gail are otherwise like being like the best of friends within these episodes, or trying to anyways. Because ultimately we have it to where eventually Gail is to otherwise try to do a good thing for Todd, and Todd eventually reciprocates by like giving Gail her accordion and her Gordon, her mannequin, and because we ultimately have it to where Gail ends up going and finding the medication uh, for Melissa, because ultimately they figure out that ultimately there's a big jug of thing that ultimately says clozapine. And so basically it's the exact same thing of what Melissa was saying, but she was saying it a little bit wrong. So we end up having it to where eventually Todd is eventually giving Melissa medication, all while there is seemingly also a birthday celebration for uh, for Jasper going on, his supposed birthday. The interesting thing about this, though, is they have it to where there's like an explosion of holiday. Like every single holiday is within one day, and I think that that was kind of very interesting. Where we end up having it to where Phil is ultimately wearing like the head of a turkey, the coat of Santa Claus, and ultimately he has on his feet um, two pumpkin candy jars or candy bags, whatever those things were, the old fashioned like um, pumpkin plastic jar things, where ultimately you would go out and go and trick or treat with them. The old, yeah, like those were placed on Tandy's feet. Just interesting visuals going on here. And then like Carol had like a bunch, she had like a tiara that had like a ton of different kind of holidays and stuff like that going all on. And so, and plus Carol ultimately gets on the case of Todd and Gail, ultimately going like, hey, what's going on with this relationship? Like it seems like there's a lot of fireworks going on between the two of you. Like what's going on? And ultimately Gail and Todd are confirming to her that they're just friends. So pushing on, so we end up having it to ultimately the real true thing that is really going on here is that ultimately this is going to come to blows between Todd and between Phil about this like holiday, because we end up having it to where seemingly the entire time it seems that Phil was going out of his way to separate both Jasper and Melissa, and because Melissa is not all that stable quite yet, and so we end up having it to where supposedly Phil is mentioning that Jasper is uncomfortable to Melissa to Todd, and we end up having to where Todd eventually goes out of his way to try to make uh, Jasper more acceptable to Melissa, and it doesn't exactly seemingly work out. So eventually, Todd and Melissa seemingly go there to this celebration to kind of crash it, because they're just like, hey man, like if anything, like you need to accept Melissa into this group, and you need to accept um, that ultimately Todd is married, or is going to be married to Melissa, because ultimately that is what happens once Melissa starts to get better, and Todd and Melissa end up getting married. Ultimately, we end up having it to where Phil is seemingly not being able to grow back his eyebrows, so ultimately Carol ends up suggesting to ultimately just letting his eyebrows breathe. So we end up having it to where shaved eyebrows Phil is ultimately kind of going around without the extra um, taped on eyebrows. And so we end up having it to where we are to push on to ultimately start to realize that uh, these women are eventually going to, at some point soon, become pregnant. And ultimately, we have it to where Phil is to suggest that he wants to deliver his own baby, and Gail is like, no. Like, I am going to deliver Carol's baby. If I am her mother, I agreed to be her mother, like I'm going to deliver this baby. And so there's a whole back and forth going on between these two people, and we ultimately have it to where Phil is trying to justify why he should be the baby deliverer, and ultimately Gail is like, dude, this guy's a loon. Like, do you really want him to be delivering your baby and making jokes the entire time? And just like, no. If anything, when something is to go wrong, Phil is not exactly the go-to guy to solve everything. Um, like Phil always solves things with a joke, and so ultimately that's to like Phil's not ready to deliver a baby. So we end up having it to eventually that Carol is to otherwise decide that she wants Gail to deliver her baby, and Gail ultimately says, "Okay, fine. We'll tell Phil that ultimately I wanted to deliver the baby, and so that way to spare you from getting between both of us." So eventually it ends up going and confirming that Gail is going to deliver the baby, and that's going to be the way it is. We end up having it to where eventually we have Erica whose water is breaking, and so we end up having it to where now we have to dedicate basically an entire episode to Erica uh, giving or delivering her child. So we end up having it to ultimately Gail is getting prepped and like prepped harder than she's ever been prepped before in her life. We end up having it to where seemingly while they are to deliver the baby there ends up being some complications, and ultimately we end up having it to where seemingly the baby isn't quite prepared to be exactly right to be able to come out of Erica's bate. And so we end up having it to ultimately there is this kind of odd like adjustment that they're trying to do with the baby within Erica to get the baby to come out. And ultimately, like Gail is very confused about what exactly to do. There's some slight hesitation, and ultimately we end up having it to where Erica is in complete pain because she doesn't have things like epidural or whatever. She has to deliver basically a natural birth, which is not an easy task. Um, so, and plus the whole confusion and stress of the birth, because otherwise realizing that, hey, like, there's going to be a new baby out of all of this, and like we're having people that aren't exactly prepared with all that. And so yeah, there's a lot of things to consider, and so we end up having it to ultimately that once they are to deliver this baby and everything is all wonderful and great and amazing and everyone's happy, we end up finding out that seemingly somewhere in the distance, that there is supposedly a nuclear meltdown happening. To where ultimately it seems that they have to all scramble and figure out how to exactly avoid said nuclear scramble or nuclear meltdown, whatever is to go on here. And so, seemingly, it seems that they realize that there is going to be a quite wide reach of this nuclear meltdown thing. Like, probably I would assess that it's basically as wide as a like if a nuclear bomb was to hit onto the United States. It seems that ultimately there is no real escape that they could justify. And so ultimately they are just like, where are we going now? Like, what are we going to do now? Like, how are we going to get out of here? And so they end up scrambling to otherwise decide that there is no real easy, safe distance of this nuclear thing happening. And so they otherwise decide to, like, you know what, I think we need to seek out to be on the ocean. Like, that will be far enough away to avoid this thing going off. And so they end up going on to the pier to otherwise justify which boat or yacht or whatever that they are going to take. And so we end up and here's the thing, I'm like, how is it that they can easily find keys for a boat? I don't know, I guess it is what it is. So we end up having it to where they go upon some lavish boat, and we end up having it to where seemingly they end up finding that when they are to go on this boat, that eventually they find out that Pat is still alive and is going to shoot and kill them. And while that is going on, we eventually have it to where ultimately that we end up seeing a seemingly shot going through Pat to ultimately have him drop like a sack to end up showing Pamela, the girl that ultimately had been stuck with her home with the dog, that ultimately was doing the things with the drones. She ultimately appears and says hi, and then that's basically how the season 3 was to end. Really, I think there are some interesting things going on within these episodes, but I also really felt, in all real honesty, that these episodes were really, to be brutally honest, they were really flimsy. They were really flimsy. There wasn't, like, it kind of feels like they were taking one episode to do one thing, and like that is kind of the worst approach that you could possibly do with a show like this, um, because there's so many things that you can go on with an ensemble piece. You could have it to where basically, like I liked before when we have it to where like the entire group hated one person, and so now we have to go and help people understand why the entire group hated one person. Like that was an interesting kind of approach, where it's like when you have Phil and Jasper kind of spending their time together, with Phil kind of just sitting in a tub of hot fudge sundae or whatever. Like that isn't exactly like, that's kind of going backwards, to me, story wise. It's kind of like how the show started out, where ultimately, like, we are forgetting there's an ensemble piece now, and we are focusing much more on very little cast. And like that's the one grievance that I think I have about these episodes. But ultimately, we get to seemingly have Phil in dinosaurish like costume one more time, uh, And I thought that that moment was kind of hilarious. Like basically him talking about how um, how reasonably that uh, the dinosaurs had been killed once before um, by an event of sorts, and so ultimately it's kind of justified now how like this event is going to try and kill the North America, South America places we know it and whatever and what have you. It'll be interesting to eventually probably see really how this show kind of goes into season four. I'm hoping it's not an entire season on the ocean. I think it would be interesting if they take and do and have the fourth season maybe having a very much European like feel, or going into another country of sorts, or going to a location of sorts that is overseas would be really interesting to if this is to end the show, then that would be a fascinating approach to ultimately go in and end it that way, with it being like, hey, if we're going out with a bang, let's ultimately go overseas and just really go out with a bang for the show. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about these episodes. Um, yeah, regardless of what I've said about like not really liking exactly how these directions were going, I still overall will continue to review the show, continue to review the fourth season, and just go about my way to otherwise still just seeing what this show will offer and what will it deliver. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, buddy. Goodbye, buddy.